Now, I sometimes do these videos where I just want to talk about that thing which is 40k itself. And this week, my brain kept churning around a lot of thoughts about the material, where it's at, what its problems are. The TLDR is 40k can be intimidating for new people to get into. And whilst it has a loyal fan base, this is not necessarily the audience that could be targeted in future mainstream screen productions. That's my discuss for today. Also, apologise, recently sick again, so my voice is not at 100%. So obviously, Warhammer 40,000 has continued to become more and more popular, we see this all the time, but my core reasoning for talking about 40k on the channel has always been to introduce as many people as possible. In fact, that's really the first reasoning for me ever doing YouTube in the first place. It wasn't because I thought, oh yeah, I can go full time with this in the future. I started doing YouTube videos because I just wanted to share ideas and get people into things that I enjoyed and that kind of thing. And that's really where it came from with 40k as well. I was obviously doing video games in the past like Armour and Battlefield, and at some point I was like, you know, I've been playing Warhammer all of my life pretty much, maybe I should make a video and talk about it. And that's where we are. So essentially it was to just introduce as many people as possible to the thing that I've spent over 20 years of my life enjoying. And I saw Louise Sugden, who works for GW, say it best recently on Twitter, where she noted, I do the opposite of gatekeeping, and I will force you to like the maddeningly niche things that I like, which is hilarious, and I relate to that a lot. Because there's nothing I enjoy more than seeing people in the comments state how you got me back into 40k after decades, or I just bought my first army, or I just picked up my first novels or audiobooks. I see this all the time, and it really always raises my spirits to see it. It pleases me because it means I get to experience that tiny shard of feeling that I would have had years and years ago when I first started my journey into 40k. But the point of today's video, my rant for today, that journey is going to be a lot more complicated now than it used to be for people coming into 40k. And obviously, as this is a lore channel, I'm thinking about it more in terms of the storytelling aspects of 40k. There are currently still issues with production and availability and the insidious scalpers of eBay when it comes to the physical products that GW puts out, but those topics are being regularly tackled and discussed currently by community people, videos, streams, and so forth. It's a heavily discussed topic. So I'm coming at this from a pretty broad perspective of just general new engagement from people discovering 40k. Games Workshop has done very well as a business in both growth and development. It's turned out an unprecedented amount of new models and literary material, more than we've seen really ever before. But at the same time, it's raised its prices several times, and you can consider that just in the general scheme of where the world is. There's that ongoing issue of stock availability, and that's been really quite problematic of late. And as always, I can only really speak for experiences in the country where I live, in the UK. I know that those of you elsewhere in the world face a variety of other issues, pricing, again availability and stuff like that. But again, I can't really speak to that too much. There have been signs of a small change of things in the past year or two, a slowdown as well in 40k and GW in general, which I think has occurred for reasons outside of people's just general interest in 40k. Mainly I think it's that during the pandemic, people had acquired enough models and material to really keep them entertained for years. They've got a backlog of stuff now. The complexity also of the current game edition is often referenced as having become really a barrier to entry. I've also heard just broadly more and more people actually taking a break right now from the rule bloat of the tabletop game. It's something people are complaining about all the time. Not to mention a severe cost of living crisis that has very likely caused many people to again temporarily put a pin in their hobbies and activities, plus of course several other unforced errors that have either been just really painfully cringy to watch or at a very minimum irritated established customers. Now these are all very important to be aware of in the context of the future growth and success of 40k as a fictional verse. But I want to talk about what I see as really a couple of the big problems for 40k both now and in the future. And it's a problem that I've heard from people both coming in new and also from those like me and probably you who have been invested in this stuff for some time. Now it's not a shock and comes in two forms that are fairly tethered together. The first is the complexity of the overall narrative, and we'll consider why that could be problematic in the near future, and the second remains the actual accessibility of material for newcomers into the 40k sphere. And by accessibility I mean literally where to buy relevant content from if it's even available. And let's deal with that one first, because it's easier. So in just the past year, but also prior, I've seen obviously more and more people coming into 40k. Unsurprisingly, people learn about 40k in different ways, friends, social media, gaming, and so on. Sometimes undoubtedly it's also YouTube, But regardless of the entry point, these things all start overlapping. People want to either read more, paint the tabletop models, play the game itself, or whatever. Now obviously, I'm focusing on the lore and the narrative side because that's the channel focus. And one of the big problems when it comes to the lore of 40k is accessibility. Now, I could talk about this in various ways, but the two core things are entry point learning and expanded learning. The first is entry point. Now that means when you come into something as complex and deep as the lore of 40k, where do you begin? I often say to people, it doesn't really matter. Start anywhere, just start reading, eventually it'll all make sense. And whilst that's true, it's also just really a throwaway comment for the ease of things. In truth, I think the best starting place is probably the rulebook of 40k. The trouble is the rulebook costs £40, which seems a little prohibitively expensive if you are new to things, not really sure if it's the thing for you. Now to be clear, I'm not talking about just learning the tabletop game. I'm talking about the fact that the rulebook probably contains the most comprehensive, focused first steps overviewing the 40k verse itself. It's got all the factions, it's got just a general overview of things. Now what I've never understood is, why isn't there a freely available, produced, official, multi-page, simple booklet that gives people the lowdown on the 40k verse? You could have it at the entrance of every store. You could easily make a digital one too. It would give people a straightforward, to the point overview of the verse. And to be honest, because that thing doesn't exist is one of the reasons why people take it upon themselves to do so on social media. But that's just the start of it. It gets more challenging when people start to ask questions about where can I learn about XYZ? What book does that reference come from? Where can I read more about it? Where can I drill down? Often I get requests from people all the time saying, can you talk about this? Can you talk about that? And I'm like, not really, because there isn't actually material about that. And of course, that's when you start speculating about stuff. But moreover, often I have to tell people, well, you actually can't read about that thing anymore because it's out of print. Maybe you can find it on eBay. And eBay has become bizarrely this sort of second point of call for people brand new even into 40k. Because as I've said repeatedly, books that say sparked the 8th edition change in lore and formed the bedrock of 40k were just no longer available soon after and not reprinted since. Yet weirdly, the first edition books, which I get are nostalgic like Rogue Trader, I get it that they're nostalgic and they have some relevance, but they're also wildly out of date. But those were reprinted, and you can also get hold of them quite readily. I just don't really understand the thought process there. Or why couldn't they have, for example, created an omnibus edition, combined the 3 books of the Gathering Storm from 8th edition, cut all the stats and gameplay, just put together in one lore book, make that regularly, consistently available. That seems a really sensible thing to do to me. But it's not just that though. There's been a huge amount of books that go out of print almost immediately after release, never to be seen again. Now to be fair, Black Library does exist online, so you can get a lot of stuff there digitally, and of course we have Audible and things like that now as well. Also, of course, Games Workshop did release their Warhammer Plus service, which has this library of material, but that is essentially just a PDF viewer. You can't download the copies of the books and lore and other stuff like that. Whereas at least with something like Audible, if you choose to unsubscribe from their packages, you can still access anything that you had purchased basically in the past. But it's not only the issue of just where to access it though. The lore of 40k is spread widely across novels, tabletop game books, the White Dwarf magazine that Games Workshop produces to go alongside its products, online articles, campaigns at official tournaments even sometimes have added to the potential pool of lore. Then of course you've got video games, you've got stuff like the RPG books who's contained reams and reams of lore, you've got the comics and so on and so on. It's all heavily fragmented. You got Necromunda, Titanicus, it's this broad plethora of content. And for somebody coming in new, that's really confusing, overwhelming, and most importantly, expensive and difficult to access. Now there isn't too much here to drill down on, it is what it is, but it is a problem. So if you're new to 40k and maybe excited to just start owning some of these books and materials and different things for yourself, because maybe you want something more than a folder of EPUBs on your desktop, maybe you want to own the actual books because they're beautiful. There's something very nice about holding a big book of lore, turning the pages, scouring through it. Yet depending on what you're looking to buy, a majority of it is not available from Games Workshop itself. You're stuck with eBay, which means you could be paying a few pounds for a paperback that came out in the 90s, or you could be paying several £1,000s for something like an entire hardback of the Heresy Black Book series, or the tabletop novel versions, to be honest. And unless those things get reprinted from time to time, that situation will only get worse over time. And what that means is that in the future, some of these things are just going to be completely unobtainable. Now, to be fair, 40k spans decades. You can't really expect Games Workshop to keep huge stocks of every book they've ever had printed sitting around. That's not how print runs work, it's not how publishing works, it's why books do go out of print. At the same time, when you're dealing with a living, active verse, it's not just like a novel, a real-time developing huge lore franchise, it seems like at the minimum, you should be keeping those core, foundational pieces of material available. Not doing so, I feel personally, it's quite a big problem, and undoubtedly frustrating and disappointing for people coming in new. They come in, they get excited, they learn about this new thing, and they're like, right, I want to find out about this. And then, oh, you can't. Is that going to change soon? Probably not. So the other, and I'm sorry to say much longer thing I wanted to talk about today, is just the challenges and the uncertainty faced about when we're thinking about Warhammer 40,000 expanding into a wider audience. Because one of its simultaneously big selling points and also hurdles for newcomers is both its tone and its complexity. Now, to be clear, it's not to say that 40k doesn't already have a pretty big audience, but I think there is this large untapped market out there for new people who would lap it up. Again, I still see pretty regularly people saying, how have I never seen this before? It's amazing. I'm binning all the other things that I was following. I think these days it's clear that people eat up material with a darker, more adult tone to it, that's true. At the same time, it does have problems that we will consider that could make it complicated to hit the mark hard and for the first time. Because 40k already has a fairly checkered history when it comes to media ventures. We're mainly talking video games here. But of course, those most recent announcements of Cavill getting behind things is quite a step above anything that's come before, but nonetheless, getting it right the first time is going to be quite critical, and that is going to be an extremely tight needle to thread. And what we're really talking about here is its complexity. 40k is not a simple narrative. I mean, in some ways, but no. It covers some pretty uncomfortable issues as well. Its tone is generally very dark, to the point it's really more horror than just sci-fi fantasy. It's arguable if it even has something that one could pin down as a central overarching storyline. I'll talk about that some more. But it can be, I suppose, if I was going to attempt to summarize it, be done for somebody who knew nothing of 40k. The introduction that has featured in almost every novel of 40k for the past few decades actually does a pretty good job of explaining it. This has been adjusted and updated over many years, but here are two, then you can see which you prefer. The first is the one which has been around for the longest time, the second is the more recent updated version. It is the 41st millennium. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind by the will of the gods, and master of 1,000,000 worlds by the might of his inexhaustible armies. He is a rotting carcass, writhing invisibly with power from the dark age of technology. He is the carrion lord of the Imperium for whom 1,000 souls are sacrificed every day, so that he may never truly die. Yet even in his deathless state, the Emperor continues his eternal vigilance. Mighty battle fleets cross the demon-infested miasma of the warp, the only route between distant stars, their way lit by the Astronomicon, the psychic manifestation of the Emperor's will. Vast armies give battle in his name on uncounted worlds. Greatest among his soldiers are the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, bioengineered super warriors. Their comrades in arms are Legion, the Imperial Guard and countless planetary defense forces, the ever-vigilant Inquisition, and the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, to name only a few. But for all their multitudes, they are barely enough to hold off the ever-present threat from aliens, heretics, mutants, and worse. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. These are the tales of those times. Forget the power of technology and science, for so much has been forgotten, never to be relearned. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grim, dark future there is only war. There is no peace amongst the stars, only an eternity of carnage and slaughter and the laughter of thirsting gods. Then we have the more recently updated version. For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of Earth. He is the master of mankind. By the might of his inexhaustible armies, 1,000,000 worlds stand against the dark. Yet he is a rotting carcass, the carrion lord of the Imperium, held in life by marvels from the dark age of technology and the thousand souls sacrificed each day so that his may continue to burn. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. It is to suffer an eternity of carnage and slaughter. It is to have cries of anguish and sorrow drowned by the thirsting laughter of dark gods. This is a dark and terrible era where you will find little comfort or hope. Forget the power of technology and science. Forget the promise of progress and advancement. Forget any notion of common humanity or compassion. There is no peace amongst the stars, for in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Now, whichever of these you might prefer, they really sum up things pretty nicely, albeit on the understanding that for someone new to 40k entirely, this is probably going to answer few questions and raise only more. Plus, as soon as you go a little deeper than that, every single detail opens a new can of questions, a deepening tangent on a tangent on a tangent. And this is what happens to me very often when I'm making a video, because I'm like, well, I can't really talk about this without talking about this and talking about that. Personally speaking, the complexity of the 40k verse is no bad thing, because it means there's some actual meat to get your teeth into, and it means you have likely years and years ahead of you as a newcomer to 40k to binge and absorb and digest an ever deeper rabbit hole of lore, a warren of lore even. If they ever truly start hammering out an ongoing series of 40k shows and movies, there's certainly going to be no shortage of material, theoretically. In some respects, that's a blessing, providing they actually do use that material. It means it's less likely to end up in the same situation as some series and shows who have established thirsty audiences, but with little actual core material. What ends up following fails to live up to the expectations of the original bare source material. And you likely have a specific show or movie in mind as I'm saying this, but the fact that there are indeed actually so many to which this applies underscores the stupidity of that situation. But this is of course a very valid concern, that being that the big movie studios, Disney, Sony and the like, they're dying for anything that they can feast upon and devour as part of their media empires. And for a fan base, it's a terrifying prospect of what could happen when, and I believe it's inevitable now to say that when one of these huge companies eventually acquires Games Workshop and 40k. To be clear, this hasn't been mentioned in any shape or form anywhere, that's nothing that's happening. But it's just I cannot foresee a future where these giant Leviathan companies do not end up attempting to secure Games Workshop as a company. To be fair, there are times where companies remain independent defiantly, but I just can't see that happening somehow. Because somehow, almost unbelievably, 40k has stayed off the mainstream radar for the longest time. I don't know how, but it's very strange. It seems to be just the way of things. Likely this is due to Games Workshop focusing perhaps so intensively on the tabletop, the game and those miniatures, because that is their core focus. And so it created this extreme desert of video-based content on an IP that was literally screaming out for it. And it only started to be filled when, of course, fans started making their own material about it, because there was this huge void that wasn't being filled for their audience. And whenever you have that happen with a very popular IP, inevitably the fans and the audience start doing it for themselves. Anyway, we all know how that story ends. But whatever show ends up being produced for 40k in the next few years is going to be absolutely massive. And I don't mean massive in terms of popularity. I mean in how hard it is to underscore just how important that big show is going to be, because it's going to set the tone and serve essentially as a pilot for all those disgustingly big companies out there who might for the first time set their green eyes on an as yet untapped world of stories ripe for harvesting. It's also going to set the tone, set the expectations of a huge untapped audience who have never really heard about 40k before. Now, it's way too early to really make any deep speculations about that. It's early days, it's unknowable how things are going to turn out in the course of time, and for as many of you, like me, are deeply cynical about such things, I'll say, let's stay the course. It's not impossible that things don't work out. It's another big weight to hang around this first project for Henry Cavill, because it needs to hit the ground running, it needs to hit the mark on both lore, accuracy, and tone. But here, though, we enter the next issue. There are many movies, many shows that have been very successful despite having a darker edge, a complex narrative, and so forth. But successful can mean different things to different people. So for as successful as these kind of productions are, despite them having a solid, proven audience, they very much tend not to be blockbusters. Because for as distressing as it is, things that are heavy in tone, heavy narrative, artistically masterful productions are often not big sellers. Is it possible for 40K to walk that line and please both audiences? Yes, it is. Is it probable in this day and age? Let's just say I wouldn't be rushing to take that bet. Well, the big problem is, how do you deliver material that explains in enough detail about the 40K verse to an audience who are both brand new to the IP and potentially don't especially really enjoy expansive details being told to them through lengthy exposition? So then simultaneously, if you flip it around, how would you deliver that action-packed, lore-thin content to a very well-read, heavily invested existing audience who really want to hear those expansive discussions and details? It's a tricky problem, but I don't want to be all doom and gloom here. I think it's achievable. For one thing, there are some aspects for 40K that work in its favour, where other series have not, for example. I think potentially 40K material could end up benefiting from the examples I've noted before about how some war movies are able to operate quite readily on multiple levels, because a war movie, when executed by a masterful director, can be seen very two-dimensionally as just well-filmed, well-produced, visually studying war, the horrors of war. As I've noted, it can also dive a lot deeper into heavier concepts, either ideologically, philosophically, or just in the study of the human condition. So it's achievable. It needn't just be war movies though. This is just an example. There's a litany of well-crafted, well-executed shows and movies that hit the marks of being compelling at multiple levels. It all comes down to the core elements of the script, the casting, the pacing. That might sound absurdly obvious, but if one of those things is not handled correctly, then the rest really fall apart, and then you do end up with something subpar. Where I think 40K may be able to tread that line between a new audience hungry for shiny things and pretty images and a heavily entrenched fanbase is its key tagline. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. I'm not suggesting that you would make a 40K film which had the kind of comedic look and feel of the movies of Paul Verhoeven, for example. We're talking RoboCop, Total Recall, Starship Troopers. But those movies do have what I'm talking about going on. They have ridiculous over-the-top violence. They have a certain aesthetic and feel to them which is pleasing to all, especially if you're interested in kind of sci-fi and that kind of thing. And then they do have some deeper points that you can consider if you want to. But if you don't, it doesn't detract or lose anything. So I think those are some good examples of where that kind of tone, where the mark can hit right. And I think that's what they're going to need to do. Because I can very much imagine that if it's handled correctly, future 40K shows and or movies can balance well that narrative and action. Many of the written material that exists has amazing locations, atmosphere, and characters. And when the action does come, it's very often well written to a point where it can be a blistering page turner. Admittedly, not always, but writing action sequences in the written word is not an easy thing. Sometimes it really can be a trudging slog. Also, for as much as somebody like myself likes to get bogged down in those heavier concepts for 40K, it's very much me. I know that there's many people who do the same, but at the end of the day, the Space Marine 2 trailer had Titus cutting a termagant in half with his chainsword and then ripping the head off a Tyranid warrior. So, you know, that's pretty 40K too. Still, you could very much imagine some heavy storylines that would work almost perfectly as a translation to a movie format. Imagine Kauth, including the Underwar, imagine Krieg, imagine Baal, and of course, yes, the Heresy. Incidentally, I really hope they steer clear of the Heresy for some time. The Heresy should not be the first thing they tackle. Although yes, it is like a landmark piece of 40K lore, if it's ever tackled, it deserves to be handled by only really the highest echelons of movie makers, and by that I mean, if not Denis Villeneuve, it would almost be a crime. Speaking of, it brings me to a decent and obvious example. Dune has been proven in both of its big screen iterations to be, of course, this rich, beautiful, amazing narrative. And I know people's opinions about the first movie are out there, but you know, it's a creative piece. But the thing is with Dune, it's also very heavy on the narrative. It's very subtle. It's not as easy to break down or lead people into, similarly to 40K. It's proven to be continually a difficult source material to translate to the screen, which reminder part 2 coming later this year, November, I believe. Now, if you've ever seen the first 15 minutes of that movie, it makes you dare to imagine what could be achieved with a 40k movie. However, for as beautifully crafted as something like that recent June movie was, it sadly didn't really hit the mark. It did fine, decently even, especially considering the situation of the world, but it didn't smash all records. Now, undoubtedly, some would say, well, it was never designed to, nor expected to. It's this very specific science fiction film. That's fair, but at the same time it brings you to that sad realization that a beautifully crafted artistic masterpiece does not necessarily equate to bums on seats. And you might not think that that matters. You might think, well, these things will stand on their own. It's not necessarily true. When you look at something like the 2012 Dread movie with Karl Urban, that movie, absolutely fantastic all the way through. The director has done interviews. He says the reason they haven't made another one, they want to make it. Even Karl Urban has said he wants to make it. Do you know why they haven't made it? Because it didn't do well enough, and they don't think that they can get the investment needed to make the film. So as much as you might not think it matters, it does matter. And there remain another issue that I touched on earlier as well, that in Warhammer 40k as it stands overall, there really isn't an overarching protagonist, and that is an issue. I think it remains debatable as to even whether a core storyline exists, or if 40k is just made up of this sort of broad patchwork of smaller stories that create the verse. I don't think that this is intentional. I think it's just what has happened as a matter of course as Games Workshop and Black Library have developed the lore of 40k, but in doing so they have failed to neatly untangle the lore setting and the lore narrative. Now you might say, what the hell does that mean? Why and how would you even do that? Well, interestingly enough, as I was putting this script together, somebody I follow on Twitter who is a writer themselves and whose opinions I give value to was making this exact same observation, which is that in most stories, if you read fiction outside of 40k, if you were to remove a main character from a novel, say, there's probably very little left to tell. There's something of a world, there's things happening, but then what? It's not exclusively true, of course. For every single piece of material they've ever produced, character series are different. Things like the Uriel Ventress series, for example, the Trademarks series, you've got these clear protagonists that you follow. Yet for a considerable amount of 40k material, you could actually remove for what counts as the main character, and there would actually still be a working story for the most part, because a lot of 40k stories and novels are descriptive of the lore setting, the lore environment. They tell you about the things that are going on, and often the main characters are in an equal balance with the other things that are happening, which I would say is unusual. And you might think, well, what's wrong with that? Isn't that just, well, fine? Yes, sort of, but also no, because it means you end up with this swirling pool of narrative, often very, very heavy in describing sort of the environments, like crazily heavy on describing the situations and the world around. Now, of course, you need to build a picture, you need to flesh out what is happening, where the characters are in a story, but I've honestly, in many 40k books, found myself often skim reading or skipping ahead, because it just gets too heavy. I found myself doing that during Plague War. That was one of the ones I did the most. I think there's one whole chapter where I kind of just skimmed through the whole thing because it was just descriptions. But I should note, this isn't something exclusive just to 40k material. Some writers love to get lost in descriptive visualizations. I seem to recall reading a Tom Clancy years back where he'd spent like 2 pages describing a backpack. And admittedly, this is why, for example, if you're doing, a movie, you have screenwriters. Somebody's going to take all that, cut it down to something that works for the screen. And this is why often people say that novels and their screen adaptations are not really comparable. They stand as separate works, because to make a novel work on the screen and usually fit something that is going to take 10 hours to read, you've got to cut it down to 90 minutes. It's going to require some pretty heavy editing. But as I say, the issue is very often 40k novels are wandering. They jump around as well between multiple different micro storylines. I think this has never been illustrated better than the new Siege of Terror book, The End and the Death. Now, to be clear, I loved The End and the Death. I described it earlier today on a Twitter post as gripping from start to finish, so many revelations, an absolute masterwork. And it is. It was a surprising amount of material as well for the first book, which I had been genuinely scared could have been just little more than setting things up for the final installment. But far from it, it had my attention from almost the start to the finish, more perhaps than many other 40k books that I've read before. Now, with all that said, objectively, it has to be one of the most unusual fictional books I have ever read, because it jumps around between different fragments of story, character, different forms of diegesis so rapidly, often as quickly as literally every 2 or 4 pages. 1 minute you're inside Malcador's head, then you're on the line, then you're under the palace, then you're another character, an internalized monologue, a heavy description of the Imperial Palace, and on and on. It's a roller coaster ride. And again, it works. Specifically because of what it is and its placement in the overall timeline of the Heresy series. If this was the first book in the Heresy, it would be insane. But where it is at the end of the Heresy, what is happening, it actually works and makes sense. But it's a complex read. It's not surprising when you consider that they're trying to tie up all the loose ends of what is, up to this novel, a 61 book series. And then on top of that, trying to explain some things that they know are necessary to give exposition to in the future lore of 40k. Still, does the format of 40k writing translate well to the screen? I think in some respects it actually would, but it would suit a multi-episodic format far better than a movie, because shows are far more flexible in their ability to switch around between different characters doing different things, but as part of a broader overall narrative that can critically take its time. Now, I'm sure there are many other examples you could give, but just off the top of my head, the famous crime drama The Wire, I think illustrates this best. It's got a complex web of characters, all with their own agendas and narratives going on, but it manages to weave them all together to create this very complex story that the audience can steadily engage in. The problem is, I just can't ever see something like the Heresy working in that format, because it's so grand, so massive, it almost demands to have the scale, weight and power of being for the big screen. Could it be done? Well, most anything can be done, it can be done, but so many of those adjacent side stories would need to be cut, you'd be left only with the absolute bare bones. Then you've got this other big issue, the protagonist. Is the Emperor the protagonist of 40k? No. Horus? No. Malcador? No. Loken? No. Ol? No. The list goes on and on. As I've said, 40k and the Heresy is not written that way. It's more like a historical documentary in some respects, a history of the Imperium, but written from an on-the-ground perspective. Few of the stories even in the Heresy series have a clear protagonist, particularly for that matter. Main character, yes. Protagonist, I don't know. Of course you've got your notable tier 1 characters, but I just wouldn't say protagonist, because it's not somebody you follow necessarily through a story for the most part. As I said, it's because the novels jump around often between different events, different characters, very often even different time periods. Garrow is one example which stands out, where you've got a clear story with an individual you're following from start to finish. You've obviously got Eisenhorn, things like that. And there's a smaller series as well that focus on the Primarchs. You've got things like Valdor, Luther, Sigismund and so on. But these are all really adjacent works. Now, to be quite honest, I've often thought that 40k is somewhat comparable to the X-Files in its structure. If you've never watched the X-Files, I apologise for the meaningless reference. But this had a format where they maintained this continuing overarching core story, but famously they punctuated it with adjacent episodes which were totally unrelated and stood on their own. They held recognisable elements of the main narrative and the way the show worked, but they stood in isolation. This is how a lot of 40k material is also written. Incidentally, the X-Files, one of the biggest wastes of a potentially amazing multi-series spanning narrative ever. I should probably talk about that as just some kind of random off-topic video at some point, because it really is a frustrating situation. The too long don't read version is, the creator of the X-Files basically bottled it, and so the whole overall story ends up being this big cop-out. I might suggest some other sci-fi shows that you could alternatively consider though, things like DS9, Babylon 5, as a very rough analogy as well. Only in the sense that they've got this core, slow-moving story going on, but with adjacent other events happening. The core difference with those shows, of course, is they have regular, established core characters, and that helps you as the audience to tether the lore setting to the lore narrative, which means the audience can invest themselves much more. With 40k, unless you've read the entirety, or not the entirety of, but some of the key books in the Heresy series, some characters you're going to only hear from once and then never again until like 30 books later, which is bonkers. I think for myself, if you were going to try and work it out somehow, You could think of it like this. Your core story, obviously, the Emperor. We're following his attempts to forge the fate of humanity from almost the earliest days of humanity through to the end of the Age of Strife, Unification, the Crusade, the Heresy, and then the long drag of 30,000 years to the modern era in M41. Now, it's not perfect, unfortunately, because this core story barely features the main character of the Emperor at all. But however you try to cut it, that really has to be the main storyline, I guess, for 40k, because it's the underpinning of everything about the Imperium and humanity. So then this core story is punctuated by a mass of adjacent stories involving a broad plethora of characters and events. But it does always come back to what is happening with the Emperor and the Imperium. The Emperor is always referenced at every turn, which is why that for me is the core focus. As I say, obviously very debatable, but it's hard to see really how it would be anything else. It's just strange that the main character barely features or speaks at all. I think this is reinforced by the fact that The Master of Mankind is one of the most lauded, divisive, heavily discussed books in the Heresy series, because it's one of the extremely rare examples for the Emperor to appear and actually elucidate some of the background. But even then, of course, barely does that, and in some ways makes it more complicated. If we want to be brutally honest, it's clear that this has been deliberate, because likely there was no end to the overall story. It has been developed over not years, but decades, and so the Emperor's character as being somebody who doesn't give anything away works when you're writing a 60+ book series and you're not sure what the ending is going to be. So it helps if your core character is keeping his cards close to his chest, because then you can make them whatever you want later. So if you are following the Heresy from the start, as most fans of 40k have been, that sort of works, because it's this air of mystery, mystique, what's going to happen in the next episode. I think, to be fair, we all know TV shows love to drag out their stories so they can spin what should be a single season into a 10-season franchise. You see this now more than ever, and it's very painful. Drip feed the audience with just enough tidbits of information to keep them satisfied and addicted enough to tune into the next episode. Again, on the flip side, if you get a show which actually does things right, like The Wire, or even some of those classic shows like Next Generation and stuff like that, every episode is gripping and interesting. But sadly, that's often not so much the case anymore. At the same time, I have already seen people give up on 40k for that reason alone. They just got bored, burned out, tired of the constant, hefty 300-page plus books that reveal maybe actually just a few paragraphs of information that really move the story forward. I've seen that happen a lot actually, and it's why people always want to know, which books do I need to read? I've also seen it in just people's pop culture YouTube streams. If I'm just scouting around or somebody directs me to some new people that I might generally be into sci-fi and fictional verses who've heard about this 40k, they're excited, maybe they've mentioned me or mentioned something, and basically it's people coming in new, they want to learn more. But when they start to ask their own audiences, their chat, some probing questions about what is this 40k, what's going on here, and they start to realise it doesn't really have a clear main character, there isn't really a clear main entry point series to start with, and even not particularly a clear side to be on. I've seen this cause people to, at best, struggle to engage with the material, and at worst give up very quickly because it seems quite a headache. And this is down to the fact that things are just not kept tight or focused enough, or at least an initial entry point that is like, this is where you start. And 40k is interesting in that regard, I have to be honest. It's something that I actually enjoy with it. I enjoy the ridiculous complexity to it, precisely because it's not just, say, a series of 5 books with a clear couple of characters you follow. But such works can of course be far more easily adapted from movies and shows. Look at stuff like Game of Thrones, Hunger Games. Now, to be fair, 40k does have its own sort of versions of these things where you've got specific characters that follow through a series, and it's quite contained. Basically, Gaunt's Ghosts, things like that. But the trouble is, Gaunt's Ghost isn't 5 books, it's 16 books. I mean, I enjoy reading, but for many people, it's mentally an obstacle to sit down and be like, okay, 16 novels, let's go, page 1, let alone 60 plus in the Heresy series. And that's just one of many examples. And I think this is why I more regularly hear of things like the Mechanicus trilogy, the Night Lords trilogy being recommended often, because it's just 3 books, it's more palatable, it's less intimidating. Now again, if you want to have some further thoughts about, reading material, first things to get into, I've often said try and choose a book which has got some short stories in. There's a lot of anthologies and those can be pretty good. Or if you want just something to sort of grind through, which is a very consistent, an omnibus is a way to go. Audiobook's fantastic as well. So with that said, let's move on to my next thing, which can be a problem, which is who to get behind. Essentially, which side do you want to take? Because that's very important for some people. But it's also very difficult in 40k. So there is often this other sticking point when it comes to 40k, and that is that there's no absolute clear separation of, let's say, the goodies and the baddies, the virtue of light and the evil of the dark, the rebels and the empire. Of course, we think of something like Star Wars, literally the dark side, but one of the most famous IPs ever had such a similar separation. In Lord of the Rings, it's very clear that the side you're meant to champion and root for. 40k, though, doesn't really have that. Or perhaps I should say, it doesn't really have that if you know the material. On the face of it, especially during the Crusade, the Imperium positions even describing itself in its propaganda as the forces of the good and the right, the light of the Emperor. Of course, we know this morally grey onion has many, many layers. Whenever a huge mainstream IP tries to give some kind of slight effort in adding moral complexity to their characters, it's most commonly done at a pretty superficial level. What I mean by that is the depth of a morally grey decision that they have to make is usually going to be something like, do we save X person or do we save X thing? It's usually boiling down to that kind of classic situation of, should one life be sacrificed to save the many? We've got to save this person, oh, but if we do, we can't stop the whole planet from blowing up. And this kind of thing, it's often really framed as heavy-hitting stuff for the mainstream movies. It's this emotional zenith for the story with big music, and they really build it up. Of course, in fact, it's pretty basic stuff. It's very trite at this point. And this stuff contrasts the best fictional content out there that weaves an actual tapestry of grey morality, usually ending up with a point where you're actually feeling unsure which side you want to root for. Because although you know which side are technically good and bad, they display each a lot of nuance in their decisions and their characteristics, to the point where you might hate certain characters or sympathise with them when you know really it probably should be the other way around. Situations where you might see good characters using untoward methods to try and achieve their objectives or even their selfish own agendas, placing the loftier goals which should be their priority lower down. The crime genre tends to do this pretty adeptly because it's dealing usually with the root driving forces of humans, the grey morality that comes into play there, especially with power situations and so forth. Still, I often underestimate how gentle nudges towards some deeper thought can actually be taken very seriously by the mainstream, again sort of thinking of it as being really heavy-hitting stuff. But it won't come as a mind-blowing revelation to say that some audiences are going to find different levels of moral and shock plot points hitting differently. My point again is just to consider, who are they aiming future 40k screen material at? We don't know. What kind of tone and depth, how bloody, visceral and horrific would they consider making it? And this is perhaps the biggest audience sway, because visible gore and extreme violence can be severely off-putting for many people. And while I think it's almost an essential component of any 40k visual translation, I would comfortably take the bet that any upcoming show or movie based on 40k is going to be very much toned down with that kind of stuff. A max rating of 12 or in that ballpark. Sorry, I'm not really familiar with US ratings, but I expect the rating they're going to be aiming at is your sort of early teens, not a 15, certainly not an 18 rating. That 18 rating is well-known death knell for profitability. Quite honestly, it wouldn't shock me if they tried to put something together that was suitable even for general audiences. A part of me feels like no matter the thirst for profits, the very idea of making a 40k product for screens that did not feature blood, slaughter, suffering in creative ways would end up being such a hollow attempt it would be almost doomed to failure. And I feel like surely anyone attempting to make a 40k show with half a clue would understand that, especially you would hope that the people allowing it to be made would understand that and underscore that. But honestly, who knows? I've always viewed 40k as more of a horror series than anything else. There's a lot of stuff in it that is just full nightmare level. Think about the weapons, the look of the things which inhabit it, even just down to the morality, the issues of people's daily lives. It's all pretty horrific stuff. So how on earth would you sanitize that for a broader audience and still maintain any air of authenticity to the source material? If you were going to make it sort of available for general audience, you'd have to gut it. Graphic brutality and extreme violence is not something that really saturates the novels, but it is something that, when it does appear, reminds you how brutal and merciless and graphic the setting is. And we're not even talking about just if you were to set a series on Medrengard here. We're merely talking about just an average inquisitorial investigation. Any hive city, any battle, life in the Imperial Guard. It's all pretty bloody awful. And if you took out that violence, the hardships, the nightmare horrors, the things that want to burrow into humans, it wouldn't be 40k. Difficult to see how that can be overcome, and difficult to see how you would do it differently and maintain integrity. Now, different audiences can enjoy different things, obviously, but it's also true that people can enjoy wildly different genres simultaneously. However, one thing tends to be clear if you look at raw numbers, which I was going to do, by the way. I was going to do a breakdown of like different movies and their profits and blah blah blah, but then I realised it took up a lot of script time, and it's basically me saying, if you look at the numbers, it's clear where the bigger audience is, which everybody knows already. It's in those big, glossy, more sanitised, fast-moving, explosive movies. And for good reason. They're designed to be. They're popcorn movies. They're specifically aimed at people who just want to go out, have a good time on a Saturday night, or to just throw on for the family as background noise. Slower, more serious narrative movies, generally speaking more cerebral, designed for people who want to appreciate things at a more artistic, thought-provoking level. There's always going to be exceptions. Back in 2016, not exactly the most heavy-hitting, gritty film, but nonetheless, Rogue One, it was aimed at a slightly older audience, but still only rated a 12 in the UK. It performed over $1 billion of worldwide sales, beating some big family movies that year like Finding Dory, Zootopia, but it still wasn't the highest for that year, which went to Captain America. Rogue One, though, clearly demonstrated that there can be exceptions to these kind of rules. If a movie is crafted well, it walks that line between popcorn schlock and a more serious tone. But do I think something like that is going to be a template for a 40k movie? For myself personally, obviously not, because 40k requires more visceral action scenes, more complex narrative, and an overall darker theme to it. But if I had to pick any box office smash that came close enough to where I thought any future 40k screen adaptation was going to land, something like an Eisenhorn story, for example, I think it's probably going to realistically be the closest fit. Because bear in mind, I just do not see them going all in and making an 18 plus 40k movie as their first outing. I just cannot see any situation where that would happen, because it doesn't open up the IP to enough people, certainly not the target audience for getting people into stuff like the miniatures, the tabletop, the IP in general. Personally speaking, as you would imagine, for me, any 40k adaptation has to be absolutely uncompromising in every way. But of course I would say that because I am probably at this point unhealthily obsessive about the extremely specific details and in-fiction world of 40k. I quite literally think about it most of the day, every day. Could they try and walk a path where they make something like Rogue One that is serious enough in its suggestions of the grim darkness which still appeals broader to all? I would lean on probably saying not. And I do think there's some other good examples, one of them though being, yes, that Star Wars series Andor. Despite being an amazing, genuinely surprising step away from what people traditionally think of as Star Wars content, and I'm no big fan of Star Wars, but I enjoyed the hell out of Andor. It was absolutely aimed at somebody like myself, which is likely why it was trashed as boring and slow by others, who I suspect were likely confused by the lack of gibbering robot and alien companions, and probably foaming at the mouth with rage as to why there was not a lightsaber on screen at least once in every episode. Outrageous. It's never going to be easy to create content which appeals to the Transformers lightsaber fetish movie crowd, while simultaneously crafting a story for those who could happily listen to Stellan Skarsgård give a 20-minute character monologue about their bleak backstory. Some people's brains would just turn to mush in minutes from the boredom, and they clearly apparently do. For somebody like me though, it would leave me wide-eyed and pressing the tell me more button.
Nameable to express the inexpressible. Tell me more.
It's obviously understandable that any media company or IP franchise owner would want to cast the widest net, dragging the maximum amount of paying customers. The trouble is, you're going to end up just delivering a more mediocre experience that fails to meet the expectations of either. And there's been the ongoing flip of this recently, with beloved shows going unnecessarily dark in misjudged expectations that adult audiences actually are expecting this now, compounded as well by poor writing. Example, Star Trek Picard series. The majority of people I know or have spoken with about that and are long into Trek seem generally far more interested in something like a next-gen DS9 era show to come back that's just upgraded a little bit. Not just the characters, but the look and the feel, the more safe sci-fi 90s era shows, curious adventures, sometimes silly, sometimes more thought-provoking. Instead, what people got was nothing that really anybody wanted nor asked for. They got dark Trek, violence, literally darker environments, scary things, beloved characters that seem to have been rewritten by those who'd never watched the originals. It's just an example of catastrophically failing to deliver content for your core audience in an attempt to follow the wider sphere of modern reboots. And a lot of people have spoken about this series, other series that are just kind of going wildly off the rails. And I think I'll just restate that there's nothing wrong with making very specific content for your said audience in mind. But it's frankly baffling, bizarre, nonsensical, painful when you see someone handling a long-established IP who have a solid built-in audience with an almost willfully belligerent attitude, like the Halo series where the writers were like, we've deliberately not played the games. They literally put that out there and said that. Now, I'm not a big fan of Halo at all or anything, but that's irrelevant because the point is, for anybody who's a long invested fan of really any IP, the same feeling would be there, just what the actual hell. And I remember everybody's heads exploding at that revelation about that series. Still, at least they were proven wrong, and this series turned out to be a groundbreaking translation of the material. Oh no, wait, it was shit. What a shocker. It's not just the insanity of it, it's the fact that it's just such a colossal waste of everybody's time, money, and the damage it does to potential future investments into translating an IP to the screen. And it seems to keep happening. The baffling litany of bizarre, unforced errors when it comes to developing IPs with decades of material to work with. These should be money printing machines. The story's written for you already. It should be a slam dunk. Hire some directors who already have an understanding and a passion for that verse. Blend your visual artistry. Bang, you're done. Instead, it's always some crew determined to make our own mark, and this happens with video game reboots and sequels as well, where it's been so long that the dev team has been near to completely replaced, or we're talking about movie updates that have been such a long time that nobody is around to really guide it, or maybe they get some kind of paid credit at the most. And then you end up with this new team feeling almost obligated to change things around. They want to have a fresh take that nobody asked for. Where what should have been a comfortable, nice, safe bet that everybody enjoyed just goes off the rails. It results in an inevitable, catastrophic fail. If an IP has a long-standing audience who have spent years, they've probably been committed to this thing of supporting it and keeping it going and maybe championing enough enthusiasm to actually make some kind of screen event or, update happen. They've been invested in it for decades. And here's the shocking truth. They don't want to be shocked, surprised. They don't want things flipped upside down, different twists and turns that nobody ever expected or imagined. What they want is the delicious gruel of familiarity. They want that same warm paste of their favourite IP they know and love, and they just want to consume it because it makes them feel good. Because that's all entertainment is, basically. It's a nice, comforting, warming mental soup that you can enjoy anytime, often in the background while you're doing other things. Why do they think people binge watch shows on repeat that are decades old? Part of it is nostalgia, but a large part of it is that those shows were just actually pretty bloody good, whereas a lot of new stuff just isn't. Now, I know I'm sounding like a cynical old man here, but for one thing, I am, and two, I'm sure many would agree, because it certainly seems to be the case in recent times with new shows, reboots, flips, whatever. Big studios are even starting to resist publicly releasing information about sales and viewership of shows, and that tells you all you need to know. It's not common for a big media company to hide their numbers when something is breaking records. They would want to shout that out from the rooftops so that everybody can hear, it can validate their investments and excite people that are not already on board to give it a try. If they're not doing that, then you probably know it's nothing to shout about. And it's a shame because ever more regularly, it seems a lot of games and media just crash and burn with franchises that really shouldn't. And loyal fans can't do anything but watch in despair. Very often the people making the show have such disregard for the audience themselves, they end up turning it around on them. It's like the audience just managed to crawl away from some wreck of a car crash and then turn around and watch it burst into flames. Anyway, getting a little dark here, but I do think that's the case. I mean, how often do you get to see a beloved IP turn into a big new series or movie?
Someone who was never a fan of Star Trek,
It doesn't happen that often. And so when it's almost willfully plowed into the ground, it's upsetting for people who realize it could be 10 years before they see somebody else take a crack at it, or maybe never. Now, just to bring things back to 40K and maybe be a little bit more positive, I will say I do feel somewhat heartened to see somebody like Henry Cavill get involved, because he clearly is, by all accounts, personally pretty emotionally invested in 40K. From what we glean, he genuinely seems to care also about respecting the lore and the background stuff in his work with any franchise. I believe that was reported as to why he was stepping away from The Witcher, because they were just starting to take too many liberties and not sticking close enough to the actual lore, and he couldn't, I guess, compromise on that. Which, if true, that's a really good sign. Again, similarly to somebody like Carl Urban, who seems like really into the lore and the source material. Still, I regularly see people continually talking on social media about how huge a 40K fan Cavill is. Now, unless I'm mistaken though, we've never really seen him at length discuss or talk about 40K. I've not seen him do any podcasts or interviews. He's thrown a few small mentions on late night talk shows, a few posts here and there on his own socials, but that's about it. To the point where I've often seen people question even, does he even have this full 40K army that he's often talking about? If so, why is it not on social media? Why wouldn't you be showing that off? We have to basically take his word on it at this point. His interviews about the material, albeit sparse, always seem genuine, heartfelt. He gives that awkwardness of somebody trying to explain to non-gaming people who've got no idea why this huge actor is talking about small toy soldiers, which is a delight, because we've all been there. So I think it gets a pass. By the way, heads up, Mr. Cavill, happy to interview you here on the channel for that reason. Hit me up on any of my socials. But it does give me some slim hope, not to mention the fact that GW already has a massive amount of reputable authors on staff who I sincerely hope are the people that would automatically get involved to work on something like this. Anyway, I think that's basically it for today. My brain has rambled on enough about this bit. Basically, don't fly too high, too close to the sun. Deliver content that's beloved by the existing huge audience. Try and bring some new people in. If you can, hit that bullseye. The rest of the dominoes will fall like a house of cards. Checkmate. Just to say a final thought, obviously this today, it's not really lore content, I know it's a little bit out there for the channel. I just thought it'd be good to sometimes throw onto the channel here some just thoughts about other stuff, talking about things that are interesting to me, other stuff. Just throw it in now and then. These aren't particularly difficult to script for me because it's a lot more sort of casual thinking. I can usually bang these out in a couple of days rather than a couple of weeks like my lore videos. And if I can throw every month an extra hour video where I'm just talking, I know hopefully there'll be enough people there that might enjoy that. So if you did enjoy, please drop a like. Helps me know to make more of this stuff. There's other things I know I've got to do. I am going to get back on the apocalypse thing because I know people want to do that. I want to get a couple of vids out showcasing models, miniatures, talk about some of the projects that I've got on the go, things like that. But don't worry, going to have another lore vid coming back very soon. So as always, thank you very much indeed for watching. Appreciate everybody's support, and I'll see you in the next one.